You know, usually when we talk about building a new habit or taking on like a massive life change or even just trying to get through a really daunting to-do list, there's this heavy, pervasive expectation that it all just comes down to grit.
Right. Just put your head down and do the work.
Exactly. The narrative is so ingrained in us,
Yeah.
you know? Just clench your jaw, white knuckle your way through the resistance, and force yourself to comply. And if you fail, like if you hit snooze or skip the workout, you just abandon a project.
Well, then it's a character flaw.
Yes. The immediate assumption from society and honestly from that super critical voice inside our own heads is that you simply didn't want it badly enough. It gets instantly categorized as a moral failing. You lacked character. You lacked drive.
Which is an incredibly binary and, frankly, destructive way to look at human behavior.
Yeah.
I mean, it completely reduces the immense complexity of our neurology to a simple toggle switch.
Yeah.
You know, you either have the willpower or you're just weak.
And it's a paradigm that totally ignores biology. We love this romanticized idea of the self-made, iron-willed individual who just conquers their own mind through sheer force.
Oh, for sure. We idolize that.
But when you actually step into the world of neuroscience and cognitive psychology and quite surprisingly, ancient Eastern philosophy, that entire grit and grind narrative just completely falls apart.
It shatters. Yeah.
We are looking at a landscape of human behavior that is infinitely more mechanical and infinitely more forgiving than just, trying harder. So today we are unpacking a highly specific Gemini notebook. This one is dated August 11th, 2026.
A fascinating document.
It really is. And the mission for this deep dive is to take this document, which offers a profound analysis of a text that is thousands of years old, chapter 6, verses 36 and 37 of the Bhagavad Gita, and see how it cross-references these ancient verses with cutting-edge brain science.
Right, because what we're going to extract from this analysis is essentially a masterclass in the mechanics of the human mind. I mean, we want to give you, the listener, a real shortcut to understanding this stuff.
Totally.
This isn't just an abstract theology lesson. We are examining how a text from antiquity accurately predicted modern cognitive science, specifically regarding willpower burnout, the true architecture of habit building, and exactly how to dismantle imposter syndrome.
Okay, let's unpack this because we need to jump right into the deep end here. We're starting with verse 36, which essentially outlines the linguistics of burnout. What exactly is this text claiming about our attempts to force ourselves into good behavior?
So, verse 36 sets the foundation for literally everything we're going to discuss today. It begins with the speaker, Krishna, stating a very firm, uncompromising conviction about the nature of the mind.
Right.
The core translation goes something like, yoga is difficult to attain by one whose mind is uncontrolled. Such is my conviction. And we should clarify, in this context, yoga doesn't mean, stretching on a mat in a gym.
Right. Not doing downward dog.
Exactly. It refers to ultimate self-mastery, integration, achieving your absolute highest goals. So the critical Sanskrit word used for difficult to attain is duprapa.
Duprapa. Okay.
Yeah, and the uncontrolled mind is referred to as asayatatmana.
Asaitatmana, let's pull that apart, because when I hear the phrase uncontrolled mind, my initial thought immediately goes to someone who is like entirely erratic, maybe highly reactive or visibly chaotic,
Sure, the stereotype of an out-of-control person.
Exactly. But the analysis in this notebook defines this so much more subtly. And in a way that targets high achievers perfectly, honestly, it basically describes the uncontrolled mind as one that relies entirely on raw willpower without altering its environment.
Precisely. And to really grasp asayatatmana, we have to look at how modern cognitive science views decision-making, because we have this fundamental misunderstanding of what willpower actually is. We treat it like a personality trait.
Like having blue eyes or being extroverted.
Right. But biologically, willpower is a metabolic function. It's a finite resource powered by the prefrontal cortex, which is the logical, planning, executive center of your brain sitting right behind your forehead.
Okay.
When you rely solely on willpower, you are basically asking your prefrontal cortex to constantly, forcefully override the older, more primitive parts of your brain.
Like the amygdala.
The amygdala, the basal ganglia parts that just run on raw impulse, emotion, and deeply ingrained routines.
And doing that, overriding those primitive parts, that takes a massive amount of actual physical energy, right? It's not just a mental strain, it's an actual biological drain on the system.
It absolutely is. Every single time you consciously resist a temptation, or force yourself to focus on a difficult task, or suppress an emotional reaction, your prefrontal cortex is literally burning glucose and oxygen. It is metabolically expensive.
Wow.
So an uncontrolled mind in this ancient context isn't necessarily a wildly impulsive person throwing a tantrum.
Sure.
It's a person operating without what the analysis calls executive friction.
Executive friction.
Yeah. They haven't built any systems to help themselves out. They're just waking up every single day staring at a highly distracting modern world and trying to brute force their way into being productive or disciplined.
Okay, I want to explore this idea of executive friction because the standard analogy for willpower is usually a muscle, right? You use it, it gets tired. But the muscle analogy kind of implies that if I just keep lifting heavy things, I'll eventually get strong enough to just hold up the world.
Right, which isn't biologically true.
Exactly. So I prefer a different way of looking at it. Imagine trying to hold back a flood with a single bucket.
Oh, that's a good one.
Right, you're bailing water as fast as you can, and for the first 10 minutes, you might feel like a superhero. You're tossing water over your shoulder, you're focused, you're making a dent.
But the water just keeps coming.
Exactly. The flood doesn't care about your bucket. Eventually, your arms get tired, you slow down, and the water wins. Relying purely on willpower is like trying to hold back a flood with a single bucket. It's mathematically impossible over a long enough timeline.
What's fascinating here is how ancient texts mapped out the exact limitations of human cognitive endurance thousands of years before we even had brain scans. They knew that when your arms get tired and you drop that bucket, that's the biological burnout the Gita is warning against.
It's not a moral failure.
Not at all. You haven't failed morally. Your biological battery is simply empty. Your prefrontal cortex is utterly depleted. And what is so remarkable is that this ancient text states this as a fundamental law, duprapa.
It's practically impossible.
Yes, it is practically impossible to achieve mastery if your strategy is just brute forcing your way through an unarchitected environment. It completely acknowledges that human cognitive endurance has hard biological limits.
But wait, I have to push back here for a second. If relying on my prefrontal cortex is, biologically doomed to fail because the battery always drains, then how does anyone ever achieve anything difficult? Is the text just telling us to give up because we're prisoners to our impulses?
No, definitely not.
Because if raw willpower isn't the answer, what is the alternative that doesn't just sound like a different flavor of trying really hard?
And that is the exact pivot the text makes in the second half of verse 36. It doesn't leave us in this state of depressing determinism. It says that for the controlled mind, the Vaishyatmana, this mastery is absolutely attainable.
Okay.
But only if they strive through appropriate systematic means. And the essential concept introduced here is upaya.
Upaya, the architecture of action.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Upaya translates directly to systemic methods, deliberate strategy, or skillful means. It fundamentally redefines what discipline actually is. Upaya is not about struggling endlessly against your own impulses.
Right.
It is about environmental design. It's about structuring your life so that you simply do not have to use willpower in the first place.
So instead of standing in the flood with a bucket, upaya is the act of actually building a dam or digging a trench so the water naturally flows away from your house.
That's a perfect extension of the analogy, yes. And to answer your previous challenge, yes, building the dam takes energy. It requires the prefrontal cortex to design and construct the system.
Right. You still have to work.
But it's a one-time capital expenditure of cognitive energy rather than a continuous daily operating expense.
I really want to dig into how this redefines self-mastery, because culturally we view self-control as suppression. We picture, like, the ascetic monk starving in a cave, or the tech CEO sleeping 3 hours a night, just gripping the steering wheel of their life until their knuckles bleed.
A hustle culture mindset.
Exactly. But this analysis points out that suppression is actually a symptom of the uncontrolled mind trying to fake control. True self-mastery, true Vaishyatmana, actually looks surprisingly boring.
Sorry, boring.
It looks like emotional regulation, structured focus, and automated habits.
It is the shift from internal force to external architecture. Let's look at the biology again real quick. We talked about the basal ganglia earlier, which is the part of the brain responsible for automated behaviors, routines, and habits. Unlike the prefrontal cortex, the basal ganglia uses very little energy. It runs in the background.
Yeah.
Upaya is the science of taking a desired behavior, which initially requires the prefrontal cortex, and systematically offloading it to the basal ganglia.
Yeah.
So it just becomes automatic.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the notebook draws a very explicit line here between upaya and modern habit theory. It specifically references James Clear's book, Atomic Habits. The phrase that always sticks out to me is, You do not rise to the level of your goals. You fall to the level of your systems,
Mm.
which is a profound realization when you really think about it. Your goal might be complete spiritual liberation or getting a huge promotion or running a marathon, but a goal is just a thought.
Yeah.
It has absolutely no structural integrity. If your daily system, your upaya, isn't scientifically designed to support that goal, biology dictates that you will fail. You will fall to the level of whatever chaotic, high-friction environment you happen to be standing in. Let's talk about what building this dam actually looks like in practice. Because if I'm listening to this right now, I want to know how to apply upaya to my actual Tuesday morning, How do we create this executive friction to block bad habits and remove friction to enable good ones?
It all comes down to manipulating affordances.
Affordances.
Yeah, the properties of your environment that basically invite a certain action.
Right.
So if you want to stop mindlessly scrolling on your phone in bed, relying on willpower means leaving the phone on your nightstand and just telling yourself, don't touch it.
Which never works.
Never.
Yeah.
Because that requires constant prefrontal inhibition. Upaya means taking a charger, plugging it into the wall in the kitchen, and leaving the phone there at 9:00 p.m.
I love that. Because it takes maybe 10 seconds of effort to plug it in the kitchen. But by doing so, you have completely removed the necessity for willpower at 11:00 p.m. when you're exhausted and your prefrontal cortex is basically offline. The friction to get out of a warm bed, walk all the way down the hall, and get the phone is just way too high for your impulsive brain to even bother with.
You're literally utilizing your own laziness as a tool. You apply high friction to the negative habit. And conversely, you apply zero friction to the positive habit.
Right.
If you want exercise in the morning, upaya is laying out your gym clothes right next to the bed. It's filling your water bottle the night before, having the workout queued up on your laptop. You are removing decision fatigue. When you wake up, you don't have to make 6 decisions before you even start sweating.
The environment smoothly guides you right into the behavior.
Exactly.
Okay, I am entirely on board with this. The logic is totally flawless. Respect your biology, build the system, use upaya, and let the environment do the heavy lifting. But I have a massive problem with this if we just stop here.
Uh-oh, what's the problem?
The problem is that human life is wildly unpredictable, and we are incredibly fragile creatures. I can design the absolute perfect morning routine. I can lay out the clothes, block the apps, set up the ultimate upaya, but then I get a migraine.
Right.
Or a family emergency happens. Or I just have a deeply depressive episode where the system entirely collapses. I miss a day, then I miss a week. The whole dam just washes away. If the entire premise of success is based on maintaining this perfect architecture, what happens when it breaks? Are we just doomed? Because the anxiety of failing the system feels almost as bad as failing the willpower test.
Absolutely. And that profound, desperate anxiety is exactly what drives the transition into verse 37. The structure of the Gita here is just brilliant. It lays out the ideal methodology, but then it immediately pauses to address the messy, fragile reality of the human condition. Arjuna, who is the student receiving this wisdom, voices the exact objection you just raised.
It is so incredibly validating to see a text that's thousands of years old essentially say, yes, but what if I screw it up?
It is the ultimate human question. Verse 37 begins with Arjuna Uvakak, Arjuna said. He asks Krishna about the fate of the person who has sincere faith, who genuinely wants to succeed, but whose mind strays due to a lack of complete self-control and who ultimately fails to reach perfection in their practice.
The two Sanskrit terms the analysis highlights here are just devastatingly relatable. Shraddha, which means sincere faith, belief, or intention, and Kalida Manasa, which translates to a mind that is restless, wandering, or derailed.
Right.
It's basically the definition of having the best intentions but still falling short.
And we really need to view this through the lens of modern cognitive distortions, specifically the sunk cost fallacy and imposter syndrome. Think about the sheer vulnerability Arjuna is exposing here. He isn't talking about a cynic who never even tried.
Yeah.
He is describing the absolute tragedy of the earnest attempt.
Yeah.
You start the meditation practice, you launch the business, you really commit to being a more patient parent. The Shraddha is completely genuine. But then the friction of everyday life wears you down, your focus fractures, and you drop the ball.
You miss the gym for 3 days, you snap at your kid, you eat the junk food, and the immediate psychological response is deeply catastrophic. We don't just say, oh, I missed a day. We say, I am a fraud. This whole endeavor is a lie.
That is the all-or-nothing thinking that fuels imposter syndrome. This raises an important question, right? Why do we assume that anything less than perfection equals total failure? Arjuna articulates a very specific fear that the notebook connects directly to the sunk cost fallacy. In the subsequent verses, he describes this fear as falling between two stools, like a scattered cloud perishing in the sky.
A scattered cloud.
Yeah, it is the terror of the middle ground.
Explain the middle ground, because I feel like this is where most of us live and suffer.
The middle ground is that extremely uncomfortable space between the easy comfort of your old life and the quote-unquote perfection of your new goal. When you commit to a path of growth, you have to sacrifice certain comforts, right? You give up sleeping in, you give up mindless entertainment, you put in agonizing effort. Arjuna's fear is, what if I give up the worldly pleasures, but I fail to reach enlightenment? What if I suffer through the discipline, but I don't get the reward? Then I've lost on both ends. I am a fool who suffered for literally nothing.
It's the ultimate transactional view of effort. We view our discipline as a currency we're paying to purchase a specific outcome. Like, I put in 100 units of upaya, so I expect to receive the perfect habit. And when we stumble, we feel like we just burned our money in a fire.
Exactly.
We think, well, I ruined the streak on Thursday, so the entire week is fundamentally worthless. It's like baking this beautiful, intricate, three-tiered cake, slightly smudging the frosting on the bottom layer, and then just throwing the entire cake in the garbage disposal because it's ruined.
Which is biologically and logically absurd, but emotionally it feels entirely true. We assume that anything less than absolute perfection equals total, irreversible failure. The brain defaults to this black and white thinking because it's computationally easier.
Oh, really?
Yeah, nuance is metabolically expensive. It is much easier for the brain to label an entire project a failure and abandon it than to sit in the uncomfortable ambiguity of, hey, I am making nonlinear progress with occasional setbacks.
So we have Arjuna paralyzed by this imposter syndrome, terrified that his incomplete effort means he's spiritually and practically bankrupt. I can vividly picture the listener right now thinking about a project or a relationship or a personal goal. They started with incredible jada, genuine enthusiasm that is currently sitting half abandoned, surrounded by a cloud of guilt.
We all have one.
How on earth does this ancient text resolve this? Because if the answer is just dust yourself off and try harder, I'm going to throw the notebook out the window. We've already established that trying harder doesn't work.
The resolution is one of the most remarkable alignments of ancient philosophy and modern neuroscience I have ever seen. It does not offer a platitude, it offers a structural reality. This brings us to the final section of the analysis, the neuroscience of incomplete effort.
Let's get into the mechanics of this. What is Krishna's response to the fear of the wasted attempt?
Krishna's response, which unfolds in the verses immediately following Arjuna's question, is a definitive, absolute reassurance. He states that no genuine effort, no matter how incomplete, is ever lost. The text insists that the doer of good never meets a bad end, and that spiritual and personal continuity exists far beyond our perceived failures.
No genuine effort is ever lost. Okay, that sounds lovely. It's very poetic, but how is it scientifically rigorous? If I try to learn French for a month and then I stop completely for a year, I can't speak French, the behavior is gone, so how is the effort not lost?
Because you are confusing the immediate behavioral output with the underlying structural architecture of the brain. The analysis breaks this down through the mechanism of neuroplasticity and synaptic weighting. We have to look at what happens in the brain the moment you exert that initial shraddha, that sincere effort.
Okay, walk me through the biology of a failed attempt.
Let's say you sit down to meditate. Your goal is 20 minutes. For the first 2 minutes, you are incredibly focused. Then your mind wanders, you get frustrated, you give up, and you spend the next 18 minutes scrolling on your phone feeling like an utter failure.
Sounds like my Tuesday.
Right. Behaviorally, you failed the goal. But neurologically, for those 2 minutes, your prefrontal cortex had to actively suppress the default mode network, which is the mind-wandering circuitry. To do that, neurons had to fire.
And we know the cardinal rule of neuroplasticity. Neurons that fire together wire together.
Exactly. This is Hebbian learning. When that circuit fired during those 2 minutes of sincere effort, it triggered a process called long-term potentiation, or LTP. Neurotransmitters like glutamate crossed the synaptic gap. If the signal was strong enough, it actually caused the receiving neuron to build more receptors. It caused physical structural changes.
It physically alters the landscape of the brain.
Yes. Furthermore, repeated effort, even incomplete effort, stimulates the production of myelin. Yeah, myelin is this fatty substance that wraps around the axons of your neurons, acting like electrical insulation. The thicker the myelin sheath, the faster and more efficiently the neural signal travels.
So when I sit down to meditate, even if I fail horribly, the struggle itself is laying down a thin layer of myelin on that specific circuit of focus and suppression.
Precisely. And here is the crucial part that directly validates Krishna's response.
Yeah,
When you stop the practice, when you fall off the wagon, that myelin doesn't just instantly dissolve.
it doesn't.
No. The new receptors don't immediately vanish. The structural changes in the brain have a much longer half-life than your behavioral consistency. The infrastructure is banked.
This completely upends the sunk cost fallacy. If the effort is banked structurally, then I am never actually starting from scratch.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you are never starting from zero. If you try to learn French for a month and quit, you might forget the vocabulary consciously. But the neural pathways dedicated to those phonetic sounds and grammatical structures have been primed. When you decide to try again a year later, the biological resistance will be measurably lower than it was on day one. You are starting from a more advanced neurobiological state, even if it doesn't feel like it.
So to translate this back to the language of the Gita, the irada, the sincere intention, did exactly what it was supposed to do. It initiated the structural change. The fact that the mind wandered the Kalita Manasa just means the system went offline temporarily. But the structural gains purchased by the initial effort are secure.
It entirely reframes the concept of failure. Failure isn't a deletion of your progress. It is simply a pause in the application of your systems. The effort itself is the victory, physically carrying you forward. You are structurally a different person than you were before you made the attempt, regardless of the immediate outcome.
So what does this all mean? Because this is a massive paradigm shift. We spend so much time punishing ourselves for the days we miss, just totally blind to the invisible architecture we built on the days we actually tried.
We ignore the myelin.
We ignore the myelin. The old model says if you don't cross the finish line, you ran the race for nothing. But this synthesis of ancient wisdom and modern biology tells us that every single step permanently altered the muscle fibers. Progress isn't a straight line on a graph. It's a gradual thickening of neural pathways beneath the surface of our awareness.
And that is why understanding the mechanics is so incredibly liberating. When you understand that willpower is just a finite glucose battery, you stop judging yourself for getting tired and you start building better upai, better systems.
Yes.
And when you understand that neuroplasticity banks every genuine effort, you stop suffering from imposter syndrome when those systems inevitably break down.
We have covered immense ground today. We started by dismantling the myth of grit, looking at verse 36 to discover why the uncontrolled mind, relying on brute force willpower, is biologically destined for burnout. We then explored the architecture of action through upaya, realizing that true mastery is about environmental design, friction, and shifting the load off our prefrontal cortex.
We then confronted the very real anxiety of the human condition in verse 37, validating the sunk cost fallacy and the terror of the middle ground that Arjuna voiced so perfectly.
And we found deep structural comfort in the neuroscience of incomplete effort, proving that no sincere attempt is ever wasted because every exertion physically builds the neural pathways for our eventual success. The effort is banked, the journey continues. But as we close out this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with one final thought to mull over as you step back into your day. We've established that every attempt, no matter how brief, lays down myelin and builds the circuitry for future success. But let's take that one step further.
Okay.
If every incomplete effort, every stutter step, and every quote-unquote failed attempt prominently alters our neural pathways for the better, making us biologically more capable for the next round, what if our entire cultural definition of a broken habit is entirely wrong? Could it be that the very act of failing, as long as it is done with sincere intention, isn't a detour away from mastery, but the hidden, absolutely mandatory prerequisite for achieving it? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.